Hey guys, it's Dani. Today we're going to talk about Phalaenopsis orchids, specifically, as the title suggests, how to make sure that all of our Phalaenopsis bloom. Not half of them, not most of them, but all of them. And I know it sounds a little bit clickbaity, but it's not actually. Because luckily for us, Phalaenopsis are those types of orchids which can be tricked a little bit. I'm not sure if trick is a good word, but maybe encouraged would be a good word. There are actually a few things that make sure that 100% of our orchid collection will bloom. And at the moment, my entire core Phalaenopsis collection is spiking, no exception. And towards the end of this video, just for the funsies, we're actually gonna film each and every one of them. I'm gonna do a head count because I'm not entirely sure how many phals I have. Might be 25, might be 30 at this point, and we're gonna see exactly how the flower spikes look like. But I also have in my collection a few Phalaenopsis which are not spiking. They're not my core healthy collection, so I think it's a good idea to troubleshoot them, see what's wrong with them, why they didn't spike, just so we know what to avoid next year. So just to be clear, today we're only gonna talk about the flower shop Phalaenopsis, the complex hybrids, not the summer bloomers. Obviously, those bloom in summer. In the fall or winter, whenever this might be in your territory, is when these orchids are prompted to spike. So with that said, let us start the subject with the general idea. Now, Phalaenopsis orchids are actually seasonal bloomers, and yes, they can produce secondary spikes or continue to bloom from the very same spike, but typically they produce new flower spikes from the base of the orchid once a year in the fall, whenever the season might be for you. So I'm not gonna say September, October, or any of these months, because in the southern hemisphere, obviously, it's spring, summer when these orchids bloom for us. Phalaenopsis orchids are triggered by a cool down in their environment, but I'm not going to insist way too much on this idea. If you want a video with a more elaborated discussion, check the description down below. I do have a video on how to rebloom these orchids. The title of this video, though, is how to make them all bloom at the same time, if possible, which is possible. So I'm only gonna touch base with that subject. And as I was saying, these orchids are prompted by a dip in temperature. Now, being that these orchids are actually different between them and they can have different heritage, the lower limit of this temperature might vary a little bit. For some orchids, 20 degrees Celsius is enough, and you'll have the conversion to Fahrenheit on the screen. For some orchids, 19 is enough, while for others, a much lower temperature than that is needed. My experience tells me that the minimum temperature should be 17 degrees Celsius during nighttime at least, and that should pretty much cover 100% of these hybrids. Maybe not 100%, maybe 99.99% of them. But I believe that if we don't go that low with our temperature, not all of the Phalaenopsis will be prompted to bloom. If you have 1 or 2 or 3 Phalaenopsis, maybe you can get away with this temperature, but as you will see, I do have quite the big Phalaenopsis collection, and I can tell you that 20 degrees Celsius, 90 degrees Celsius, it's really not a good temperature for everybody. If I want to have all of my collection spiking, I need to go down to 16, 17 degrees Celsius. Now, the differential between daytime and nighttime doesn't seem to matter all that much. It never did for me, for my collection. So I would say that even if you have warm temperatures during daytime, but low temperatures in the nighttime, this will work. I can even say that if you have lower temperatures in the daytime and a few degrees lower to 16, 17 in the nighttime, it will work just as well. It doesn't really seem to matter the differential between day and night. It matters the lower limit of the temperature range, in my personal experience. So that will be rule number 1, the cool down in temperature, which I know can be slightly tricky for some of you, but as I was saying, luckily there are a few hybrids which can actually be triggered by a little bit higher temperatures than this. So this is the general rule. Everybody needs a cool down. But now let's actually get to the troubleshooting and see why some of these orchids didn't want to spike, even though I gave them the cool down. First of all, new orchids. As I was saying, controlling temperature makes them bloom. But let's presume that your growth space is not influenced by the weather outside. You can actually control the temperature in your growth space. Well, you can make them bloom pretty much in the middle of summer, right? Because they will not know it's summer. This is how commercial nurseries make Phalaenopsis orchids bloom. This is why they're available in flower shops all year round. So if you purchase a Phalaenopsis which is already in bloom in August or September or whenever the end of summer or fall might be in your region, that orchid most probably will not produce a new flower spike. It might continue to rebloom from the existing flower spikes, but a new flower spike might not appear. There are cases in which it might, but many cases in which a new flower spike will not appear. So this is the exception to the rule when you're hoping that all of your Phalaenopsis will be in spike. Some of them will already be in bloom because you purchased them that way. And that's perfectly fine, perfectly normal. You don't need to worry that your brand new Phalaenopsis doesn't produce a new flower spike, even though you provided the cooler temperatures. Second exception to the rule is stressed orchids. This is a pretty general term, so I'll try to split it in a few categories. First of all, the orchids which suffered root loss, leaf loss, or even the loss of their crown. These orchids are stressed due to losing one of their structures. What they're doing now is actually focusing on producing new leaves or new roots. In the cases where we're dealing with crown rot and the orchid is producing basal keikis, we might not have flower spikes this year depending how big the keiki is. So all of these things that usually put a lot of pressure and a lot of stress on orchids might determine the orchid not to spike, no matter how much of a cool period we provide to them. So the best thing to do with these orchids is to actually maintain them rather warm. We need high temperatures to speed up their metabolism. We need to continue to feed them and baby them and just provide the best care that we can. A flower spike would actually be detrimental in some cases, since these orchids first need to be healthy. They need to have roots, they need to have leaves, and afterwards they need to bloom. If we don't have a good, healthy orchid, we cannot actually have a good, nice display. It makes sense. There just isn't enough energy for everything. And I'm saying this because in some cases, even stressed orchids can actually bloom. In this case, we have an orchid with a damaged crown. It created a basal keiki. Luckily though, the keiki managed to grow quite a lot and is now producing a flower spike. But in some cases, the keiki might be very tiny and it will still try to produce a flower spike, or in the other case, this orchid that doesn't really have roots will try to produce a flower spike. In these instances, I personally just prefer to cut the flower spike and let the orchid focus on its roots. So the second rule, making sure we don't stress our orchid, making sure that our Phalaenopsis has healthy leaves and healthy roots. These things will significantly elevate our chances of having flower spikes. Next up, orchids that are sick. A bacterial or fungal infection, a pest infestation, everything that could put a different type of stress on the orchid can actually eat up so many resources that no energy will be put into flowering. And again, this is a pretty broad subject. It has again to do with stress, but it's a different type of stress. Some diseases we can control. If we maintain our grow space aerated, ventilated, we can actually minimize fungal infections. Good hygiene minimizes the spread of bacteria or even viruses. Making sure that our orchid does not have pests or any other disease is just as important as making sure that it has a good root system, a good leaf system, and so on and so forth. And because I pulled this orchid in front, this is the purple orchid, which I know has the the orchid fleck virus, and it is a systemic virus. It lingers on, and you can see the orchid has no flower spike sprouted just yet. Even though it appears to have some roots and some leaves, I think you can clearly see there is something wrong with it. Third of all, the care we provide to our orchid. Now, there are many things we can actually do wrong with our culture with Phalaenopsis orchids, but I think I do have a #1 culprit for non-blooming orchids, and this is light. Phalaenopsis orchids are known to be lower light orchids, but this doesn't mean they grow under our desk. So I'll just show you my little experiment. Throughout this year, I kept both of these orchids here. This is the last shelf on my southern window. It's a little bit too cloudy outside right now, and it appears a little darker than it typically is. But these orchids don't get artificial light. They do get some natural light, but just bouncing back from the surfaces, nothing very bright. I would call it pretty low light. Let's just see if they have flower spikes. First up, there is no flower spike emerging from any of the leaf joints. On this one, there's really nothing. Although the orchid looks quite nice, And on the bigger one, again, no flower spike in sight, nothing in between the leaf joints, or actually in between the leaves, nothing that I can see. Although the orchid looks pretty nice, pretty luscious, there really is no flower spike emerging. So as you will see when you grow Phalaenopsis, you'll discover they are pretty resilient, pretty easy to take care of, not so finicky. Even if the orchid is not in the best of shapes, it will still pretty much try to bloom in the vast majority of cases, even if you don't feed it all the time. Maybe you don't have a full variety type of fertilizer, maybe you just have an NPK fertilizer. At least for a while, the orchid will try to bloom. It is that type of orchid. But in my experience, when light is insufficient, there are very high chances that the orchid will not bloom. The fact that Phalaenopsis orchids are lower light plants doesn't mean they grow in the dark, it just means they don't need a lot of light. But they do kind of need light, and it doesn't really need to be sunlight either, or natural light. All of my Phalaenopsis, which by the way, all of these are in spike right now, they're all grown mainly under artificial light. I have some natural light just bouncing from the walls, nothing direct on that particular shelf though. There are no UV rays, there are no sun specks, no nothing on these orchids, just the ambiental natural light which bounces from the walls, which is not much. What I do have though is just a normal daylight bulb. These are IKEA fixtures, I talk more about them in the description, and this is enough. This is what you need with a Phalaenopsis. However, under your disc, I don't think it will work. Now, of course, other things in their culture will affect the blooming as well. If you don't water in time, don't feed enough, the orchid might not produce as many flowers. But in most cases, they will produce flower spikes. As I was saying, these are man-made hybrids created to produce. They're very productive in comparison to other Phalaenopsis species. So even if culture is not spot on perfect, these orchids should do okay. However, when it comes to light, I would definitely go for bright shade with these orchids, or even artificial light. Now, a few other ideas to the environment though, which are related but not really on the subject. Temperature. There are certain hybrids which will lose their buds or even their flowers in lower temperatures. They do prefer slightly warmer temperatures. So from the moment the flower spike is initiated to the moment it flowers, temperatures should be elevated a little bit. Also, the use of fertilizers and orchid food in general promotes a better and showier bloom display, but at least in the first years of owning a Phalaenopsis is not really the #1 factor of a non-blooming orchid. Good culture generally caters to a better bloom display, to multiple spikes, to multiple branches, of course, if the genetics permit. So having good culture in mind is a good thing, although it's not the #1 reason why orchids don't bloom. Light though is. And to be fully honest, that is about it. That's all you need to do for your Phalaenopsis to bloom. Pretty much guaranteed, unless we're dealing with a genetically misfit individual, which is very, very rare, but it can happen. If we make sure that all of these guidelines are respected, there is absolutely no reason why our Phalaenopsis should not bloom. And because I talked so much and didn't actually show you any proof, now it's time to count the Phalaenopsis in my collection and to look at their flower spikes. Hopefully it's gonna be fun. If you're not interested in that, you can skip this part of the video, and I hope this was useful for you. So with that said, let's count the orchids on the flower spikes. 1, 2, this one has 2 flower spikes. 3, this is the singolo. 4, many of these have no ID, so I'm not entirely sure what they are. 5, 6, 7, 8, this has 2 flower spikes. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, this has 2 flower spikes, 26, 27, 28, 29, this is a newer orchid actually, I didn't even repot it yet. 30, oh, I have so many Phalaenopsis. 31 and 32, these are the orchids from Jessica, but they didn't arrive with flower spikes. These ones did. These ones already had flower spikes. But I think that's about it, I hope. Found another one, 33. This is a stressed orchid. So even stressed orchids can actually bloom, it's just not all of them. At this point, I'm not entirely sure if I missed any, but I think it kind of proves the point that I wanted to make. 33 orchids spiking at the same time. Phalaenopsis orchids, that is, and if not all of them, then most of them complex hybrids. There's nothing magical about it. You don't need a greenhouse to obtain something like this. You don't even need the sun. Just look at my orchids. All you need is to make sure that all of these things that I talked about, the stress thing, the light situation, the cool down, you have to make sure they all happen. If you do that, I really don't see any good reason why they shouldn't bloom. So alrighty guys, I hope you've enjoyed today's video. As I was saying, it is Phalaenopsis season, so we might start to talk a little bit more about them, maybe train some flower spikes. Do you guys want me to try to make a cascade once again? Let me know. I personally prefer the pendant aspect. Do you remember a few years, actually no, a year or two ago, I had everything pending or drooping down. It was beautiful. I prefer pendant displays, but I can definitely try to make that cascade. If you don't know what I'm talking about, check the description. I'll link you to it down below. You can actually train the flower spikes. So do let me know down below in the description what you'd like to see about Phalaenopsis spiking. Anything related that I can do around this period, I can do it. So alrighty guys, thank you so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed it, and you know the drill. Like or dislike this video below. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, Q&As, and other fun orchid subjects. And if you like YouTube to notify you whenever I upload a new video, just turn on notifications for my channel. If you're interested in my setup and exactly the name of all the lights and everything that I use, my fertilizers and so on, I do list everything down below together with a few details about my environment. So with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!